After 27 years monitoring biohazard containment, the new director said I was paranoid and fired me. My name is Wilson Morris, and for 27 years, I was Global Biotech Senior Containment Specialist. That's a fancy way of saying I was the guy who made sure the nightmare stayed locked up. I started there fresh out of college in 1997, when the company was still small enough that everyone knew each other's names. Back then, we were developing agricultural solutions, drought-resistant crops, natural pesticides, things that could feed the world. But money talks, and military contracts whisper even louder. By 2010, we'd pivoted to defensive biological research. That's corporate speak for weaponizing bacteria and viruses, then figuring out how to stop them. The work paid well, but it came with a price that went beyond the six-figure salary. You learn to sleep lightly when you know what's growing in the lab's 3 floors beneath your feet. I'd seen containment breaches before, small ones, controlled ones. A researcher gets careless with a petri dish, or a ventilation filter fails. We had protocols for everything. Isolation procedures, decontamination sequences, emergency lockdowns. I helped write half of them. The other half, I'd refined through experience that nobody should have to gain. My colleagues called me paranoid, but paranoia keeps you alive in this business. I ran drills monthly when the regulations only required quarterly. I personally inspected every seal, every filter, every backup system. I kept detailed logs that nobody read and filed reports that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. But I kept doing it because I understood something that the pencil pushers in their corner offices never would: the things we studied down there weren't just dangerous, they were patient. The researchers came and went, drawn by the prestige and the money, but few lasted more than a few years. They'd develop nervous tics, start drinking too much, or wake up screaming from dreams about what they'd seen under the microscope. I was one of the few constants, the institutional memory that remembered which protocols worked and which ones got people killed. But companies change, especially when private equity gets involved. Jonathan Blackwood arrived at Global Biotech on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a Harvard MBA and a mandate to optimize operational efficiency. He was the new director of operations, brought in by the board to modernize our systems and, more importantly, cut costs. I knew we were in trouble the moment I saw his presentation slides, streamlining legacy procedures, and right-sizing personnel redundancies. Our first meeting was a disaster. I'd prepared a comprehensive briefing on current containment protocols, risk assessments, and budget requirements for the upcoming fiscal year. Blackwood listened for exactly 12 minutes before cutting me off. "Wilson, I've reviewed your department's spending, and frankly, it's excessive," he said, not bothering to look up from his tablet. "We're running lean across all divisions. Your paranoid approach to safety protocols is a luxury we can no longer afford." "Sir, these aren't luxuries. They're the difference between." "Between what?" "Fear-mongering and actual risk management." He finally looked at me, and I saw the smug certainty of someone who'd never watched a colleague dissolve from the inside out because of a microscopic mistake. "Your own data shows we haven't had a significant containment breach in 8 years. That suggests we're overinvesting in redundant safety measures." I tried to explain that the absence of breaches was proof the protocols were working, not evidence they were unnecessary. But Blackwood had already made up his mind. He pulled out a folder marked with my name. "I'm sorry, Wilson, but your position is being eliminated effective immediately. We're consolidating containment oversight with general facility maintenance. It's nothing personal, just business." 27 years of service, and he fired me like I was middle management at a failing retail chain. Security escorted me out that afternoon, standard procedure for anyone with high-level access. I handed over my badge, my keys, and my access codes. But I didn't hand over my knowledge, and I didn't stop caring about what was locked away in those underground labs. 3 weeks after my termination, I was still trying to adjust to unemployment when my phone rang at 2:47 a.m. The caller ID showed a number I recognized, Dr. Amanda Torres, one of the few researchers who'd actually listened when I briefed new staff on safety protocols. "Wilson. Thank God you answered." Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong here. Really wrong." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What kind of wrong?" "The new maintenance crew, they don't understand the protocols. They're treating level 4 containment like it's a janitor's closet." I tried to stop them, but Blackwood said I was overstepping my authority. She paused, and I could hear the fear in her breathing. "Wilson, they've been using the wrong cleaning solutions in Lab C7. The ones that compromise the bioseals. Lab C7. My blood went cold. That's where they kept Project Highland, a modified strain of hemorrhagic fever that could theoretically survive outside a host for weeks under the right conditions. It was supposed to be inert, a research sample only, but I'd never trusted the documentation on that project. Amanda, you need to report this immediately. Call the CDC, call. I tried. Blackwood intercepted my report and had me written up for creating unnecessary panic. He scheduled me for a performance review tomorrow morning. Her voice cracked. Wilson, I think they're going to fire me too. After she hung up, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those bioseals, about the complex chemical interactions that kept the containment systems intact. The wrong cleaning solution could compromise the molecular bonds, creating microscopic gaps that would be invisible to routine inspections but large enough for certain pathogens to escape. I pulled out my laptop and accessed the technical specifications I'd saved during my years of service. The numbers confirmed my worst fears. If someone had been using standard industrial cleaners instead of the specialized compounds required for level 4 containment, the degradation would be gradual but inevitable. The seals would hold for weeks, maybe months, giving everyone a false sense of security. But eventually, they would fail. I tried calling Blackwood's office the next morning, but his assistant said he was unavailable for consultations with former employees. I tried reaching out to other contacts within the company, but most were too afraid of losing their own jobs to rock the boat. The few who agreed to listen dismissed my concerns as the bitter complaints of a disgruntled ex-employee. That's when I realized I was on my own. Dr. Amanda Torres was fired the following Friday. She called me from the parking lot, her voice hollow with defeat and barely controlled rage. They said I was fostering a culture of unproductive anxiety, she told me. 23 years of research, Wilson. I've published papers that are cited in textbooks, and they fired me for asking questions about cleaning supplies. We met that evening at a coffee shop downtown, far from Global Biotech's corporate campus. Amanda looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from watching something you've dedicated your life to crumble in front of you. There's something else, she said, stirring her coffee absently. Before they escorted me out, I managed to copy some files. Maintenance logs, cleaning schedules, chemical inventory reports. Wilson, it's worse than I thought. She slid a flash drive across the table. They've been cutting corners everywhere. Not just the cleaning protocols, they've delayed equipment maintenance, reduced air filtration cycles, even started buying cheaper laboratory supplies from unvetted suppliers. All to meet Blackwood's cost reduction targets. I plugged the drive into my laptop right there in the coffee shop, scrolling through document after document that painted a picture of systematic negligence. The maintenance crew had been using household bleach in areas that required specialized disinfectants. Air filtration systems that should have been serviced monthly hadn't been touched in 4 months. Even the backup power systems for the containment units were overdue for inspection. This is criminal negligence, I muttered, screenshots flying by on my screen. How long has this been going on? Since about 2 weeks after you were fired. Blackwood brought in his own people, a contracted maintenance service that charges half what the specialized crew was costing. Problem is, they have no training in biohazard protocols. They're treating a level 4 research facility like it's an office building. I closed the laptop and looked at Amanda across the table. She was one of the good ones, a researcher who understood that the science we were dealing with could end civilization if it ever escaped containment. But she was also scared, and I couldn't blame her. What do you want to do about this? I asked. I want to expose them. I want to make sure everyone knows what Blackwood is doing before it's too late. Her jaw set with determination. But I need help. I need someone who understands the technical systems, someone who can translate the data into terms that regulators will understand. That's how our unlikely partnership began. Over the next several days, we worked together to compile a comprehensive report documenting every safety violation, every cut corner, every compromised protocol we could identify. Amanda handled the scientific analysis while I focused on the technical specifications and regulatory compliance issues. But getting anyone to listen was harder than we'd expected. The CDC referred us back to Global Biotech's internal safety department. The state health department said it was outside their jurisdiction. Even the local news station seemed uninterested in a story about maintenance procedures at a biotech company. It was Amanda who suggested we reach out to Dr. Michael Brennan, a former global biotech researcher who'd left the company 5 years earlier after a dispute with management over safety protocols. He'd since become something of a whistleblower, testifying before congressional committees about the lack of oversight in private biological research. Brennan agreed to meet us at his home office, a converted garage filled with computer monitors and filing cabinets full of documents related to his ongoing legal battles with the biotech industry. "I've been waiting for something like this," he said after reviewing our evidence. "Global biotech has been cutting safety corners for years, but they've been clever about it. Never enough to trigger automatic regulatory reviews, just a gradual degradation of standards that stays below the radar." He pulled out a thick folder marked GB Internal Communications and spread several documents across his desk. "I've been collecting information about Blackwood's cost-cutting measures ever since he was hired. Corporate emails, budget reports, personnel records. Your evidence fills in some crucial gaps." The picture that emerged was even worse than Amanda and I had suspected. Blackwood hadn't just been cutting safety costs, he'd been systematically dismantling the institutional knowledge that kept global biotech's operations safe. Experienced staff had been replaced with cheaper alternatives. Specialized equipment had been substituted with generic alternatives. Even the computerized monitoring systems had been upgraded with less expensive software that lacked crucial safety features. "The question is," Brennan said, "what are we going to do about it?" Our attempts to expose global biotech safety violations hit one roadblock after another. Brennan's connections in the regulatory agencies were sympathetic but ultimately powerless. They needed concrete evidence of actual violations, not just documentation of policy changes. The fact that no accidents had occurred yet actually worked against us, making our warnings seem premature and alarmist. Meanwhile, Blackwood wasn't sitting idle. Within a week of our meeting with Brennan, I discovered that my bank accounts had been frozen pending an investigation into alleged misuse of corporate resources during my employment at Global Biotech. My lawyer said it was clearly a harassment tactic, but fighting it would take months and cost more than I could afford. Amanda faced similar retaliation. She received a cease and desist order claiming she'd violated her employment contract by disclosing proprietary information. Her attempts to find new employment in the biotech industry were mysteriously unsuccessful. Every promising interview seemed to end with the same polite rejection after her potential employers conducted background checks. "They're blacklisting us," she said during one of our clandestine meetings. "Blackwood has connections throughout the industry. He's making sure we can't find work anywhere that might give us a platform to expose what's happening." But our biggest setback came when Dr. Brennan suddenly stopped returning our calls. When Amanda and I drove to his house, we found it empty, with a "for sale" sign in the front yard. His neighbors said he'd moved out in the middle of the night, claiming he had to relocate for family reasons. A week later, we understood why. News broke that Brennan had been arrested on charges of corporate espionage and theft of trade secrets. According to the news reports, he'd been caught attempting to sell proprietary research data to foreign competitors. The charges were clearly fabricated, but they were effective. Brennan's credibility as a whistleblower was destroyed, and our strongest ally was neutralized. That's when I realized that Blackwood wasn't just cutting costs, he was actively covering up the extent of the safety violations. The fact that he was willing to destroy careers and manufacture criminal charges suggested that the situation at Global Biotech was even worse than we documented. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of continuing to fight through official channels, I decided to gather evidence myself. I knew the facility better than anyone, every access point, every blind spot in the security system, every maintenance corridor that could provide unseen access to the restricted areas. It took me 3 weeks to plan my infiltration. I waited for a weekend when the skeleton crew would be minimal, when the automated systems would be running on reduced monitoring schedules. I'd kept copies of security protocols and access codes that hadn't been changed since my departure, another example of Blackwood's cost-cutting measures. On a Saturday night in November, I slipped back into the facility that had been my life's work for 27 years. What I found there confirmed my worst fears and revealed horrors I hadn't even imagined. The containment systems were failing. Not dramatically, not obviously, but steadily and systematically. Bioseals that should have been replaced monthly were cracked and degraded. Air filtration systems were operating at reduced capacity. Even the temperature control systems that kept certain pathogens dormant were running outside acceptable parameters. But the most terrifying discovery was in Lab C7, where Project Highland was stored. The specialized containment unit had been upgraded, with a cheaper alternative that looked identical but lacked the molecular-level filtration systems required for that particular pathogen. The original unit was sitting in a storage room, tagged for disposal to recover its resale value. I was documenting everything with a hidden camera when the security alarms went off. Blackwood had anticipated that I might try something like this, and he'd modified the security protocols to alert him personally of any unusual access patterns. Within minutes, I could hear security guards converging on my location. I barely escaped, but not before triggering an emergency lockdown that sealed the compromised containment areas. It was a temporary measure at best, but it bought time for the evidence I'd gathered to be analyzed and distributed. The next morning, Global Biotech's legal team obtained a restraining order preventing me from approaching the facility or contacting any current employees. They also filed criminal charges for trespassing and attempted theft of trade secrets. The evidence I'd gathered was ruled inadmissible due to the circumstances under which it was obtained. Amanda and I were effectively silenced, our credibility destroyed, our resources exhausted. All we could do was wait and hope that the temporary containment measures I'd activated would hold long enough for someone with actual authority to investigate our claims. We didn't have to wait long. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my failed infiltration attempt. I was monitoring news feeds and social media for any mention of Global Biotech when I noticed an unusual pattern. Several area hospitals had reported increased admissions for severe flu-like symptoms, all clustered around the neighborhoods adjacent to the biotech facility. The symptoms weren't quite right for seasonal flu, high fever, hemorrhaging, rapid organ failure. It looked disturbingly familiar to the effects I'd documented during my years of studying Project Highland and similar bioweapons research. I immediately called Amanda, but her phone went straight to voicemail. When I drove to her apartment, I found it empty, with signs of a hasty departure. Her neighbor said she'd seen Amanda leaving with several suitcases in the middle of the night, claiming she had a family emergency. That's when I realized that Amanda hadn't been blacklisted from the biotech industry, she'd been recruited by it. Someone had made her an offer she couldn't refuse, probably combined with threats she couldn't ignore. All those meetings where we planned our investigation, all those documents we compiled together, she'd been reporting back to Blackwood the entire time. The betrayal stung, but it also revealed the true scope of what we were dealing with. Blackwood hadn't just been cutting costs and covering up safety violations, he'd been conducting an elaborate intelligence operation to identify and neutralize anyone who might expose Global Biotech's activities. Amanda's recruitment was probably part of a larger strategy to monitor and control potential whistleblowers. But there was something else, something that made Amanda's betrayal almost irrelevant compared to the larger crisis. The hospital admissions weren't just clustered around the biotech facility, they were spreading in a pattern that suggested airborne transmission. Whatever was escaping from the compromised containment systems wasn't staying contained to the immediate area. I spent the next 48 hours conducting my own epidemiological analysis, tracking news reports, social media posts, and medical facility websites for any indication of the outbreak spread. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to look for it: a biological agent was loose in the community, and it was moving fast. The breakthrough came when I cross-referenced the spread pattern with meteorological data. The contamination was following prevailing wind patterns, which meant it was definitely airborne. More importantly, the timeline suggested that the initial release had occurred exactly 3 weeks earlier, the night I triggered the emergency lockdown. My attempt to contain the situation had actually made it worse. The lockdown procedures I'd activated were designed for routine maintenance, not for actual containment breaches. Instead of sealing the compromised areas, they'd redirected airflow through backup ventilation systems that lacked proper filtration. I'd essentially created a pathway for the pathogen to escape the facility entirely. The guilt was overwhelming, but I didn't have time for self-recrimination. If my analysis was correct, we were looking at the early stages of a biological disaster that could potentially spread far beyond the local area. The modified hemorrhagic fever virus from Project Highland was designed to be more virulent and more transmissible than its natural counterpart. In the right conditions, it could cause casualties in the hundreds of thousands. I tried reaching out to every contact I had in government agencies, research institutions, and news organizations. But my credibility was already destroyed by the restraining orders and criminal charges. Everyone I spoke to treated me like a disgruntled ex-employee making wild accusations to get revenge on his former employer. That's when I made the most difficult decision of my career. Instead of continuing to fight through official channels, I decided to take direct action. I couldn't stop the outbreak that was already in progress, but I might be able to prevent it from spreading further by sabotaging the source. Global Biotech's containment systems were still compromised, still releasing contaminated air into the environment. The temporary measures I'd activated 3 weeks earlier were failing, and the facility's automated systems were trying to compensate by increasing ventilation rates. Every hour that passed meant more pathogen released into the atmosphere. I had to get back inside the facility, not to gather evidence this time, but to permanently shut down the compromised containment areas. It was essentially a suicide mission. The levels of contamination in those areas would be lethal within minutes of exposure. But it was the only way to prevent the outbreak from spreading to other cities, other states, potentially other countries. I spent 2 days preparing, gathering equipment and reviewing facility schematics. I wrote letters to be delivered posthumously, explaining everything I knew about the outbreak and providing detailed technical information about the containment failures. If I didn't survive, at least there would be a record of what really happened. On Thursday night, I made my final approach to global biotech. The facility was operating under enhanced security protocols, with additional guards and perimeter monitoring systems. But I knew the building better than the people who designed the security upgrades, and 27 years of experience had taught me how to move through the facility undetected. What I found inside was worse than I'd imagined. The outbreak hadn't just compromised Lab C7, it had spread throughout the underground levels, contaminating multiple research projects and creating a toxic cocktail of biological agents that no one had ever studied in combination. The facility's automated systems were failing in cascade, with each malfunction triggering additional problems. The backup power systems I'd warned about were overloaded, the air filtration systems were clogged with biological debris, and the temperature control systems were fluctuating wildly. But the most terrifying discovery was in the central monitoring station, where I found evidence that the outbreak had been detected days earlier. Internal communications showed that Blackwood and his team were fully aware of the containment failures, but instead of initiating emergency protocols, they'd been working to cover up the evidence and blamed the situation on equipment sabotage by disgruntled former employees. They were going to let the outbreak spread while positioning themselves as victims of industrial terrorism. Standing in that monitoring station, surrounded by evidence of Blackwood's criminal negligence and deliberate cover-up, I realized that shutting down the contaminated areas wouldn't be enough. The outbreak was already spreading, and without proper medical intervention, thousands of people were going to die while global biotech's executives protected their stock prices and legal liability. I had to do more than just contain the source, I had to make sure the truth got out, even if it meant sacrificing any chance of my own survival. The facility's communication systems were still operational, connected to both internal networks and external emergency services. If I could access the central servers and broadcast the truth about the outbreak, along with detailed technical information about the pathogen and potential treatments, it might give public health officials the information they needed to mount an effective response. But first, I had to deal with the immediate crisis. The contaminated areas were pumping biological agents into the atmosphere at an accelerating rate, and the facility's backup systems were actually making the problem worse by trying to maintain normal operations despite the cascade of failures. I made my way to the main environmental control center, 3 levels down from the monitoring station. The hallways were filled with the acrid smell of failing filtration systems, and emergency lighting cast everything in an ominous red glow. My radiation detector was clicking steadily, not from radioactivity, but from the ionization caused by the high concentrations of biological material in the air. The Environmental Control Center was a maze of computer terminals, mechanical systems, and backup controls that I'd helped design during the facility's construction. Every system had multiple redundancies, multiple fail-safes, multiple ways to override automated functions. But those same redundancies were now working against containment, as backup systems activated to compensate for primary systems that were failing due to contamination. I started with the air handling systems, manually shutting down the pumps and filters that were spreading contaminated air throughout the facility and beyond. Each system required a complex sequence of commands, safety overrides, and manual confirmations, procedures designed to prevent accidental shutdowns that could endanger research projects worth millions of dollars. The irony wasn't lost on me. All those safety procedures that were meant to protect the company's investments were now preventing me from protecting human lives. As I worked through the shutdown sequences, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. The automated systems were detecting the manual overrides and trying to restore normal operations. Emergency lighting switched to full brightness, and recorded announcements began playing warnings about unauthorized modifications to critical systems. I knew I didn't have much time before security responded to the alarms, but I also knew that each system I shut down was reducing the rate of contamination release. Every minute I could might save lives in the surrounding communities. The next phase was more dangerous. I had to access the contaminated areas directly to manually activate the emergency sealing protocols that should have been triggered automatically when the containment breaches were first detected. These protocols would flood the affected areas with chemical agents that would neutralize most biological materials, rendering them harmless but also making the spaces uninhabitable for decades. I suited up in the heaviest protective gear I could find, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The concentrations of biological agents in the contaminated areas were beyond what any protective equipment was designed to handle. I was essentially walking into a death sentence, but it was the only way to prevent the situation from getting worse. Lab C7 was my first stop. The specialized containment unit that housed Project Highland had completely failed, its seals dissolved by the cleaning chemicals that the untrained maintenance crew had been using. The air was thick with particulate matter that my detector identified as active biological material. I found the manual sealing controls behind a panel marked, "Emergency Use Only, Authorized Personnel." The irony of that warning, given that I was no longer authorized personnel, might have been funny under different circumstances. I entered the activation sequence, confirmed the chemical flooding protocol, and sealed the lab permanently. 1 down, 6 more to go. Each laboratory required the same process: access the manual controls, activate the chemical flooding protocol, and seal the area permanently. With each lab I processed, I could feel the effects of contamination despite my protective gear. My detector was screaming continuous warnings, and I could taste metal in my mouth, a sign that biological agents were getting through the filtration systems. By the time I reached the final lab, my hands were shaking and my vision was starting to blur. But I pushed through, completing the sealing protocol and ensuring that no more contaminated material could escape from the underground levels. The final step was the hardest: accessing the communication systems to broadcast everything I'd learned about the outbreak, the cover-up, and the technical details that might help public health officials respond effectively. I made it back to the monitoring station as sirens wailed in the distance, emergency responders finally arriving at the facility. My message was already uploading to every communication channel I could access: internal corporate networks, emergency services databases, news organization servers, and social media platforms. The truth was finally getting out, but I wouldn't be around to see the aftermath. I'm recording this final statement from the isolation ward at St. Mary's Hospital, 3 days after my infiltration of Global Biotech. The doctors say I was exposed to lethal levels of biological contamination, but somehow I'm still alive, though I know that won't last much longer. The hemorrhagic fever is progressing rapidly, and there's no treatment for the modified strain that Blackwood's cost-cutting measures released into the community. The information I broadcast from the facility has triggered the largest public health emergency response in decades. CDC teams are conducting door-to-door health screenings in a 20-mile radius around Global Biotech. The company has been shut down by federal marshals, and criminal charges are being filed against Blackwood and his entire management team. Amanda Torres turned herself into federal authorities, providing additional evidence about the cover-up in exchange for immunity from prosecution. She's testified that Blackwood knew about the containment failures weeks before I triggered the emergency lockdown, and that the decision to continue operations despite the risk was made at the highest levels of corporate management. The official death toll stands at 43, with hundreds more infected and dozens in critical condition. It could have been much worse. The sealing protocols I activated prevented the outbreak from spreading beyond the immediate area, and the early warning I provided allowed health officials to begin contact tracing and quarantine procedures before the situation became completely uncontainable. Dr. Michael Brennan has been released from prison. The charges against him dropped when federal investigators confirmed that the evidence used to prosecute him had been fabricated by Global Biotech's legal team. He's now working with congressional committees investigating the lack of oversight in private biological research, using this crisis as a catalyst for comprehensive regulatory reform. There's talk of naming new biosafety regulations after me, Morris Protocols, or something similar. The irony is that everything that happened could have been prevented if the existing protocols I'd developed over 27 years had simply been followed. But I suppose that's how progress works in government regulation. It takes a disaster to make people pay attention to warnings they've been ignoring. I don't know how much time I have left, but I wanted to make sure this account was complete. Not for vindication or recognition, but because the next Wilson Morris, the next person who spends their career trying to keep nightmares locked away, needs to understand what they're really up against. It's not just the biological agents, though those are terrifying enough. It's the human factor that will kill you: the executives who see safety protocols as profit-killing inefficiencies, the administrators who treat institutional knowledge as expendable overhead, the politicians who cut regulatory budgets and then act surprised when disasters happen. The pathogens we study are dangerous, but they're predictable. They follow biological rules, respond to chemical treatments, can be contained with proper procedures. It's the people who make them truly terrifying, the people who are willing to gamble with civilization itself if it might improve their quarterly earnings reports. If you're reading this and you work in any field where public safety depends on following complex protocols, remember this: paranoia isn't a character flaw in our line of work. It's a survival skill, both for you and for everyone who's counting on you to keep the monsters locked away. The emergency lights are flashing again outside my window. Another ambulance arriving with more victims of Blackwood's cost-cutting measures. The doctors think they might have identified a treatment protocol based on the technical information I provided, but it's too late for the first wave of casualties. Too late for me. But maybe not too late for the next outbreak, or the one after that. Maybe someone will read this account and decide that some things are too important to be left to market forces and quarterly profit reports. Maybe the next time someone like Blackwood shows up with promises of efficiency and optimization, there will be people in place who remember what happened at Global Biotech. 27 years I spent keeping the nightmares contained. 3 weeks it took for corporate greed to set them loose.